Thomas, I'm very happy to have you again, and you were featured in the past year and a half in our newspaper. I hope we're going to have more opportunities to talk about Crusade, and this time we're going to talk about the First Crusade and the siege of Edessa and Antioch, and somehow the fall of the Seljuk Empire. I wouldn't say the fall because they continue to play a major role in the region, but it was a blow for them. First Crusade was a blow to Seljuks, who established themselves in Asia Minor and northern parts of Iraq and Syria. Your specialty is the First Crusade and the siege of Antioch, and of course, before that, siege of Edessa. What can you say about these events?
Well, first, thank you for inviting me again. It's always a pleasure to participate to this with you. And I'm quite happy that I'm able to talk about my article that was published in April. So, well, thank you for that. So yeah, I've been looking at siege warfare during the 12th century. So, of course, the siege of Antioch during the First Crusade in 1097 to 1098 is a very important siege in the historical narratives. It occupies a lot of pages and a lot of sources, probably one, if not the best documented siege that we have. Though I'll come back a bit later on the sources to explain them in a bit more depth, because despite we have a lot, they're not the best in terms of information. And on the other hand, the siege of Edessa in 1098, or what I should call the second siege of Edessa in that year, in 1098, because there was a first siege a bit earlier the same year, is not getting the same attention. It's summarized usually in the paragraph in different sources. So we have two very different sieges, one that is well documented, the other that is on the other end of the spectrum as well. But the siege of Antioch has been studied by most historians. There have been a lot of writings about it. It's probably one of the two major events happening during the First Crusade, with the siege of Jerusalem. Obviously, you have other very important episodes like the siege of Nicaea or the Battle of Dorylaeum, but I would say the siege of Antioch and the siege of Jerusalem are probably the two most important events and the two that have been covered the most by historians. On the other hand, the siege of Edessa is a bit the ignored one, and hasn't benefited from much coverage when it's not simply ignored, as I've tried to show in my article, that the early phase of the campaign, basically what's happening before the siege of Antioch, is usually ignored when we look at that attempt of the Muslims to raise the siege, to force the Crusaders to raise the siege of Antioch. And yeah, usually the siege of Edessa and what's happening before the Muslim relief force arrive in Antioch is ignored. So initially, I was going to work about the siege of Edessa in my own PhD, because I found some interesting logistical events taking place during the siege. So that's why I first looked at the siege of Edessa. But it became clear quite fast that there was way more than I thought with that siege, and that initially I thought could potentially explain why one of the relief force, the Islamic relief force that was sent by this time by Kerbogha, the ruler of Mosul, why did it fail basically in the campaign? Because usually, traditionally, we explain that by his poor commanding abilities. But I was finding other reasons that were explaining the failure or potentially explaining the failure. So I decided to explore that topic. And that's how I came to look at the entire campaign and the Siege of Antioch and the Siege of Edessa in a bit more depth for that article. Um, but yeah, I think overall it's quite an important siege, despite the Siege of Edessa, despite it doesn't get the same amount of primary sources. Do you want me maybe to explain what the primary sources are?
Yeah, please go ahead for our viewers. And I'm
Yeah, of
going to ask you,
course.
what primary sources did you have regarding the siege of Edessa and the siege of Antioch? Because without primary sources, many of these events are going to be like a fairy tale, and we cannot reconstruct the event.
Yeah,
This is
yeah, exactly.
what we study on the first year of historiography, how to distinguish primary and secondary sources. So please go ahead.
Yes. So yeah, on that difference, I think yeah, that's a good idea to show the difference between secondary sources and
Exactly.
primary sources. So secondary sources, when we speak about the Crusades, would be those that have been written by historians, by modern historians, so mostly since the 19th century. It's about how we look into the primary sources, so what has been written at the time of the events or near the time of the events. If we take the case of the Crusades, sources were usually written for the earliest in the mid 11th century or early 11th century, and most of them in the 13th and 14th century. And you have a few later sources in the 15th and 16th century. But obviously, historians tend to go for the earliest source they can, possibly trying to find someone that witnessed the events themselves because it is potentially more reliable than
Or
someone
documents
writing.
from that time that would testify
Yeah,
more of the army or
yeah. So
yeah, go ahead.
for for the First Crusade, we mostly rely on written sources that we call narratives, which are technically for Latin documents, it's what we call historia or chronicles. It tends to be sort of written by monks, and they tend to try to narrate events that were meaningful to them, though they're not just a diary or archives as you could use from a government because it's their own vision of the events when they've lived through the events, which is not always the case. And they also add a lot of biblical references in the text without always saying that it's a biblical reference. So it's very hard to see. They also sometimes completely make up some events just for the sake of the narration. So it's very complicated to distinguish what might have happened or not.
And also the
Um,
historians.
so that's the primary sources. That's
Yeah.
the medieval sources, what
Yeah,
has been
the
written at
medieval
the time of the
sources,
Crusade.
and many of them are not professional historians like more
Yeah,
contemporary authors. So
yeah, of course.
we have to take
They're monks.
accounts with the skepticism.
Yes, exactly. You need to be very cautious when using them. They're not objective sources. To be fair, there is no objective source. Even modern historians, we all have our own bias. We all have our own understanding of the past, and sometimes we just don't know about a source that existed that another historian knew about, or we could have accessed something that someone else didn't. So there is always a bit of subjectivity in historical work, but for medieval sources, um, it is they try to be accurate and reliable. It's the aim, but the thing we have to understand is that for them, an episode from the Bible is as reliable, or the Quran, if we take
Yes,
Islamic
of course.
writers, is just as reliable as what they have seen with their own eyes. So for them, it's reliable and accurate. It's just a different perception of what we would call the truth or of that. Um, so that's why for them, telling a biblical episode or inventing a story that relates to the Bible is reliable as well. But overall, what we have is mostly Latin sources for the First Crusade. We have nearly 20 of them in terms of historical narratives, in terms of chronicles, historia. You also have letters. You also have a few paintings, drawings that exist. However, I'm mostly working on narratives. I'm not working on letters. I'm not working on paintings or visual sources. Um, so you have these Latin sources, and I think the most known and the most used is what we call the anonymous author of the First Crusade, or also named the Gesta Francorum. So the deeds of the Franks. And it's a story written by a contemporary that participated in the crusade that might have been a knight in the army, but we're not entirely sure of his identity. That's why we call him the Anonymous.
Yeah.
So it's probably the earliest source, and it was quite favorable to one leader of the First Crusade, so Bohemond, that became Prince of Antioch. So that would be for the Latin sources to just have a sort of broad overview of it. Then you have Arabic sources, which in other periods are very complete, very exhaustive, but for the First Crusades, they tend to be very short, mostly ignoring the event or just saying that Antioch had fallen and that Jerusalem was taken. You don't have a lot of information overall in
Maybe they were
the
not
bits
very
of
eager to
information.
describe these events.
Yeah, it was obviously not something that was in favor of Islamic leaders because
Yeah,
they sustained a defeat. Some of the early writers might not also have understood the importance of the event and how much that would destabilize the region for a while as well.
yeah.
That might have underestimated. And the same authors tend to depict a bit more the events when they start understanding that it's not just one event, but it's going to be something longer. The phenomenon of the Crusades. So you have a few Arabic writers that are very interesting. I think the most interesting one in terms of my work was Kamal ad-Din, which is an author from Aleppo that wrote in the 13th century. So he's not lived through the events, but he's especially well informed for what happened in the 12th century and also during the First Crusade. And you have very interesting elements. He had very good sources. We know some of them, some disappeared since as well. But yeah, so Kamal ad-Din probably is my main source or the one that was bringing the most. You have other authors, but less. You don't have like 20 different Islamic sources for those that wrote near the event. Um, you have a lot of Islamic authors that slightly mention the event, but they're more later authors from the 14th and 15th century. If you look at 12th century author, you have Ibn al-Qalanisi, you have Ibn al-Jawzi. If you look at 13th century, sorry, you also have al-Azimi in the 12th century. And if you look at the 13th century, Ibn al-Athir and Kamal ad-Din are probably the most famous of them. So you have these sources that is interesting to have because it offers a sort of counterpoint to the Latin sources. But the Siege of Antioch in Latin sources is usually over 100 pages for each source. In Islamic sources, it's a paragraph. So
Yeah, there's a
you
big
really don't have the same
discrepancy
amount. Yeah, you
between
don't have the same
Islamic
amount
sources and
of events.
Frankish sources. Do we have Arab Christian sources? This is
So
also
you
important because
have,
there is the
and that's probably one of the most important part, I'd say, where my article went different than what has been made before, is that I took into account Oriental Christian sources
yeah.
written in Armenian, written in Syriac, written not really in Greek. You have in Greek some sources, but they're not providing a lot of information on what I was looking at, but they exist. And you also have Arabic Christian sources, but here again, that were not the most important on my own research, but they do exist and they're important in other topics. But I would say, especially Armenian and Syriac sources, were extremely important in terms of impact on what my research produced. And to name at least one author, Matthew of Edessa, so a priest, an Oriental Christian priest that was living in Edessa most of his life. That's why his name is Matthew of Edessa. Is probably the most important author of all that I've used, especially when looking at the Siege of Edessa and the early stage of the Islamic campaign against the First Crusade. He's a very important one, and despite that, he's been discarded by a lot of historians, and I don't know why. I don't know why he's been discarded. My first explanation was maybe because of the language, but it's a source that have been translated very early in the 19th century. So the translation issue cannot be the cause of it. Was it because he was judged less reliable than Latin authors? I don't really see that either in historical works, but that might be an explanation. I don't think he's less reliable than others. And he was an eyewitness of the Siege of Edessa, so he's very well positioned for it. So yeah, the last explanation is probably just the tendency of historians to favor Western sources, Latin sources of what we would probably group as Oriental sources, even if it's not an ideal term, but Arabic sources, Oriental Christian sources, which are very important, which have been used more and more, obviously, in the last few decades. But there's still some work to do, as we might discuss in a bit more depth on some specific events a bit later in the talk. But there is still more work from historians to treat all source equal.
So after you studied these sources, what was your conclusion regarding the counter campaign by Seljuk emirs and
Yeah.
Muslim leaders of northern Iraq and northern Syria, who tried to regroup and face advancing Crusade armies at Edessa and Antioch?
Yes, so maybe first I should explain what was the
We're
understanding by
talking about
historians before me.
1097, 1098.
Yeah, so basically the Crusade, just maybe to contextualize slightly very fast, the Crusade is called in 1095. It starts in 1096. The Crusaders came from Europe, goes through all what we would be today modern Turkey, in Anatolia, and they arrive in Antioch in 1097, which is a city that nowadays is in southern Turkey. They besieged the city for about 8 months. So we're in 1098 by that point, and the city is struggling. The city is calling for help. So early in 1098, you have a first relief army that is sent by the leader of Damascus, and the army fail. And then later on, you have another, not an army, but a coalition of multiple armies that is sent by multiple leaders in different parts of the Islamic world, coming from Jerusalem, coming from Damascus, but the most important contingent coming from Mosul and led by the leader of Mosul, Kerbogha, which was quite a prestigious name in the 1080s in the Seljuk armies. So that man is probably the leader, or at least one of the leaders and the most prominent one. And he started his campaign in late March, maybe before, but at least in late March, 1098. And the campaign failed at the end of June 1098, the 28th of June 1098. So initially, when historians looked at the events, they estimated that the reason for the failure of Kerbogha against the Crusaders was because he was a poor commander, that had no diplomatic skills at all, that alienated the other armies against himself by his behavior, uh, but also by his arrogance that engaged in the final battle in a very bad way, and that's why he would have lost. I thought that explanation was a bit too simple, um, a bit a bit too straightforward as well. So I tried to look at the sources again and started to find out that more explanations existed, um, and that he was probably not as much of a bad commandant as it had been argued in the past. Um, and so instead, I've been looking at especially the structure of that coalition, of the army itself, to show that it wasn't ideal at all. Um, Also, historians have argued that the coalition had a numerical superiority, a very heavy numerical superiority compared to the Crusaders. But I find out as well that if that was true at the start of the campaign, it was probably not as true by the time of the final battle as well, because massive desertions had happened in the Muslim army. Um, so here again, trying to nuance things a bit. And when historians have looked at the mistakes made by Kerbogha, or what they believe were mistakes, they basically speak about the final battle mostly. So the battle in the 28th of June 1098, what we would call a Bridgegate battle, which is probably the sort of most epic moment of the Siege of Antioch as well. Was a major battle between the Crusaders and Kerbogha's forces. And the other mistake that other historians identified is besieging Edessa itself. They usually argue that it was a waste of time. And maybe we will go back in a bit more depth in these specifics and why I suggested that there wasn't as many mistakes as that, and that what has been considered as mistakes were not as well. So I don't know in which order you want to look at that, but
Well, we can look at that in chronological order.
yeah, of course.
We can start with
Um,
1097.
yes. So in 1097, the Crusaders arrive in front of Antioch, and they start besieging the city. The city is held by a man named Yahisian, which is the governor of Antioch. He's quite powerful emir in the region. And for quite a long time, in most of 1097, both the Crusaders and the garrison of Antioch are really equal in terms of power. Not in terms of size, but in terms of power. The garrison resist well. They attack the Crusaders regularly. They sally outside the settlement quite frequently. Um, the Crusaders suffer from a lot of food shortages, which is not the case of the garrison at all. And by the start of 1098, um, the Muslim neighbors start to act against the Crusaders, not in a unified way. That's something that's important to understand. Yarisian is a personal enemy of the Lord of Aleppo, Ridwan. So Ridwan is not helping him at all. The Lord of Damascus is helping a bit, Dukak. But most of the leaders around doesn't involve themselves at that point. It has been raised by historians that maybe the Muslim leaders saw the Crusaders as another mercenary force that they could recruit and employ against their other neighbors. It's especially true when we look at Egypt. that were held by the Fatimid Caliphate at that time, and they sent diplomatic talks to the Crusaders and attempted to negotiate their, let's say, an alliance with them against the Seljuk that were holding Damascus, that were holding still Jerusalem at that point, even if it didn't last very long. And it was a fight that had lasted since the Seljuk invasion in the 1070s. And they were probably seeing the Franks or the Crusaders as an opportunity to recruit more troops and to direct them against their own enemies. If we go back to the siege, at that point, we're in spring 1098, and that's when the Lord of Mosul, Kerbogha, decided to answer the call of Antioch, the call for help, and raise an army, but also gather a lot of different lords from the region around Mosul and also in Syria. So what we call Syria at the time is probably what we would call the Levant nowadays. So it's basically going from the Red Sea up to southern Turkey. It's way bigger than modern Syria, but it includes cities like Gaza, like Jerusalem. It includes Damascus, Aleppo, and Antioch as well. So from all that space, he's trying to gather different forces. So initially, historians thought that the campaign started in early May 1098. The only journalist that was going against that was Amin Malouf, which is a very famous author of the Crusade, because he wrote a book named The Crusades Through the Arab Eyes, which is of a very debatable quality overall. But on this regard, he's probably the author that went the closest to the actual duration of the campaign, and instead of early May, suggested late April for Kerbogha to start his campaign. It's obviously still too late, but I'll explain why. So basically, what happens for me is that I try to reconstruct that campaign from its start to its end. And so the departure from Mosul could not have happened later than the 31st of March 1098, because I tried to recreate the march and to cover the distance between Mosul and Edessa, which is 410 kilometers in straight line. It's not 410 kilometers by the roads. It's in straight lines. You would need a certain number of days. You can't just teleport your army, and that was the main problem of former estimates, because the estimate was that the siege of Edessa started on the 4th of May 1098. So the campaign could simply not have started in early May or even in late April, because to cover 410 kilometers, you need.
Yes, what happened now?
Time, Christian source, the Armenian source, that was providing a different duration for the siege of Edessa than the Latin sources. So the 4th of May, as the start of the siege of Edessa, is really a date if you read the Latin sources. If you read Matthew of Edessa, the operation against Edessa start on the 15th of April. So already we have an issue with primary sources. And I don't know why, but that primary source of Matthew of Edessa has been ignored by modern historians. If we take, for instance, the main work that nowadays is the reference on the First Crusade, that has been written by John France, Victory in the East, it's how it's titled. He discussed between Fulcher of Chartres, which is one Latin author, and Albert of Aachen, another Latin author. So the first one was present during the siege of Edessa, and the second one never set a foot in the Near East. but he's very well informed. Um, though Fulcher Chart is saying that the siege is lasting 21 days. Albert of Aachen is saying that the siege lasted 2 or 3 days. I think I think 2 days. Um, so already you have an issue between these sources. And Matthew of Edessa says that it lasted 40 days. So you have three different durations, and John France is basically ignoring Matthew of Edessa's accounts and only discussed Albert versus Fulcher. And he decided to favor Fulcher because he's an eyewitness. He participated to the siege. And I think it's a pretty genuine insight when you have a difference between Albert of Aachen and Fulcher Chart to say, well, one was an eyewitness, one wasn't. So let's follow the eyewitness account because he's probably better informed. The problem is that in doing that, he's completely ignoring Matthew of Edessa, which was also an eyewitness and said 40 days. So initially, when I started to work about that, I decided to take both potential durations into account and to try to reconstruct the campaign this way. But later on, I find out that someone had worked on the topic, and it's Susan Eddington that basically worked on Baldwin the First reign, so the first count of Edessa that was besieged by Kerbogha, and she made an assumption that I think is really good on who the different sources, despite they give different dates, could in fact all be right in their own ways. So she suggests that the assault against Edessa, so the most intensive part of the siege, would have lasted 2 or 3 days, while Albert of Aachen is arguing. But the overall siege would have lasted 21 days, so the blockade would have lasted 21 days. And then she thinks that the 40 days that we're mentioning Matthew of Edessa were maybe not for the siege itself, but for the entire campaign in the region around Edessa. So we know, for instance, that Kerbogha pillaged the different harvest around in villages and towns near Edessa. So I think she probably have the better explanation to say that the campaign around Edessa lasted 40 days, the siege lasted 21 days, and the assault against the city lasted 2 to 3 days. So
So it
overall, I think that worked pretty well.
was more than 2 months, actually.
So already then, how much time did it took from Mosul to Edessa to walk? And that took an average of 30 kilometers per day, which is the very maximum speed his army could have gone. It's probably lower than that. He was probably marching slower than that. But if we take that fastest estimate, he departed from Mosul on the 31st of March. Might have been earlier if his army was not going as fast, but that was the idea. So start 31st of March instead of 1st of May, which was what historians argued. So already a big difference here, because it means that the campaign lasts longer. We all agree that the campaign ended on 28th of June. But overall, it's a switch between a campaign that lasted about 2 months to a campaign that lasted over 3 months, which doesn't seem like a huge difference in modern days. But for medieval armies, campaigning an extra month is huge. It's a huge commitment. Logistically, economically, it's very important. It's a huge difference. The cost of the campaign raised dramatically. But yeah, let's do it chronologically. So we had the siege of Edessa. That is a failure. Kerbogha is not achieving to take Edessa. not because the defense is extremely good, but because at one point, the lieutenant in his army, the other emirs, are probably pressuring him to raise the siege and go to Antioch instead.
Mhm.
Now it's difficult to be sure that it is the reason because there's not a lot of sources that mention that episode, but we can't reject it entirely. I think it's probably very accurate because we know that most commanders were not just deciding themselves at the time, but they were having a council. So the fact that a council might have said, "Well, we're not making a lot of progress in front of Edessa. Let's go to Antioch." That might be a better target. Um, is believable. So if we look at that episode, then he arrived at Antioch at the start of June. So he's leaving by the end of May and he's arriving at the start of June. Exactly, he's leaving the 25th of May from Edessa and he's arriving the 6th of June in front of Antioch. Um, there, during that period, the Crusaders managed to take Antioch, um, and it really changed the campaign because initially, if Kerbogha arrived before the Crusaders took Antioch, there would have been a battle between the two armies. But now the Crusaders are protected by the walls, so it moved from a battle to a siege. So that means the campaign is going to be longer. And historians have argued that besieging Edessa was a mistake because of that. Changing the campaign from a battle to a siege being more complicated, taking more time, and that would have been a mistake. And they often speak about the delay created by Edessa, thinking that Edessa was not an objective,
Yeah,
that Antioch was the only objective. And that's probably where I start to disagree a lot with what historians have been writing, because Kerbogha's objective is pretty clear. It's to destroy the First Crusade.
of course. And
And to destroy the First Crusade,
to destroy the contingent in Edessa that can attack his rear.
yeah, so basically, to destroy the Crusaders, he needs to take both Edessa and Antioch.
Yeah,
So if he take Antioch, then he has to come back to Edessa.
of course.
So that's probably where historians have missed the objective of the campaign. It wasn't just to relieve Antioch, it was really to destroy the entire crusade. And in that regard, Edessa could not have been ignored. And as you said, another objective is if you leave Edessa untouched and move towards Antioch, then you have an enemy on your rear. It can
Exactly,
attack you, and they did.
of course.
They did attack Kerbogha's troop, not the main army, but they attacked the supplies.
Yeah, of course.
And you never want an enemy stealing your supply when you're besieging someone. Um, so that was a reason, but you have many other reasons why Edessa should have been besieged. One of the most important. Okay.
So, what was the major objective? This is where we stopped.
Yes. So for the siege of Edessa, so the major objective was probably to avoid having an enemy in your back.
Yeah,
Um, Also, obviously, as I said, just to take Edessa because it was also part of the objective to destroy both Crusaders and not only one. Another objective was also to secure the loyalty of the army, and that's probably one point that have been underestimated by historians a lot here. And we have to look at the structure of the army. So the army of Kerbogha is not like modern armies in which troops are professional, that are loyal to their country and fight for the nation. We're far from that. You have an army that is divided in what we could call three categories of troops. The first would be the personal troops of the emir himself, what we call an askar, which is usually composed of some professional cavalry troops and some infantry. in the instance, if we take Kerbogha's army, it's probably about 15,000 men, this Askar, maximum. And amongst that, a few thousand cavalry at best. Then to this, you add what we would call auxiliaries or mercenary troops. In that case, the Turkmen or Turcoman, which tends to be the two terms that are used a lot. And these troops are very good fighters, but they don't fight for an objective that would be fighting for Islam at that point, because they're not fully Islamized at that point. They fight for money. They fight to enrich.
Of course.
It's like mercenary troops. Yeah. They're not paid to fight in the army, which would be the difference with mercenaries. They're more auxiliaries, so they join an army and hope to make enough money by the loot that would be taken.
They're looters, yes.
And then the third category of troops would be what we would call the volunteers of the faith, or mutawiya or mutatawiya, depending on the term. And these usually have no military training. Their military value is very poor. They're not going to make a difference in the battlefield. They even can create more problem than advantage. But still, they can be a nice added number. And overall, so if we add the different personal armies all together of the different lords that joined, plus the Turkmen themselves probably have about half the entire army in terms of numbers, and the volunteers of the faith, we might have an army that numbers between 60 to 90,000 men. Might. And it's very, very much the highest estimate we can have. It might be lower. Some other historians estimated 35 to 45,000 men. I'll come back on numbers a bit later, but I estimate that both estimates are accurate. The first one probably being the army at its highest peak in terms of number of troops, and the later one being the army before the final battle. But yeah, so if we look at that structure of the army, you have Turkmen that have no loyalty toward Kerbogha, that has no interest in denying the Crusaders to take over Edessa and Antioch. Their only objective is to get loot, to get money. And that has been a constant issue for Islamic armies in the early 12th century and in the late 11th century. Usually, either they get loot quite fast, or they disband after a few days or a few weeks at best. So if we look at the situation here, the siege of Edessa and the region of Edessa in itself is a very rich region. It has been not spared by war, but not touched by war as much as Aleppo, for instance, or Antioch in the decades before these events. So it's a very rich area. So besieging Edessa can also provide that loot. If you take Edessa, then you can pay the Turkmen and ensure that they're going to remain loyal for a bit longer. So that's a very important objective in attacking Edessa. And the last objective is probably to secure the loyalty of one of the major emir joining the campaign by rewarding him with Edessa, by giving Edessa in terms of giving it as a fief, or in Islamic terms as a nikta. So you have a lot of objectives, a lot of reasons to besiege Edessa, and you have very few reasons to actually avoid Edessa. The main reason to avoid Edessa would be to try to arrive to Antioch faster.
Yeah.
So why would you do that? Why would you try to arrive to Antioch faster? Because it's the point that historians made. He should have avoided Edessa and gone to Antioch. I believe that's wrong, but that's what has been argued. So the main reason for them is to say, if they arrived earlier, they would have attacked the Crusaders before they took Antioch, and they could have had a better chance to succeed. But for me, that reasoning doesn't hold for two reasons. The first one is that when he besieged Edessa, the entire army has still not gathered. In fact, he has the troop from Mosul, and he has the troop from what we call the Jazira, so the region around Mosul. Um, he has probably about half his army by that point, maybe a bit more. The troop of Damascus, Homs, Hama, Jerusalem, and the Arab contingent have still not joined the army.
Mm.
And they're major contingents. They're very important, and they bring a lot of professional troops. So would he have been able to defeat the Crusaders with half his army is a real question, especially when you look at what happened in the Crusades before Antioch. So I mentioned earlier the Battle of Dorylaeum.
Yeah.
Basically, when the Crusaders crossed Anatolia, they fought a major battle at Dorylaeum, and they defeated the Rum Sultan there, so the Seljuk of Anatolia. And well, the Muslim army at Dorylaeum was larger than what troops Kerbogha had by himself. So if you're in the position of Kerbogha, you don't want to engage in a battle with
No, you're
half
going
your
to
army.
wait for reinforcement. You're going to wait
You're going to
2 more
wait.
weeks
Yeah.
for Arab
And
troops from Syria.
exactly. And if you wait, well, better to try to take Edessa in the meantime. That is one of your two main objectives for the campaign as well.
Yeah.
So that's the first reason why I don't believe that he could have just gone straight to Antioch. The second reason is a bit more explained in primary sources. It's a question on whether the Crusaders would have taken Antioch even if he had ignored Edessa and gone straight for it. Because the argument of historians is to say, well, if he had gone, the Crusaders would not have been able to take the city. And I believe that's wrong, because I believe that's not a good reading of primary sources. So the primary sources, what they tell us is when the news of Kerbogha leaving Edessa arrive in the camp, in the Crusader camp at Antioch, then they try to activate the betrayal of Firuz in Antioch, because Antioch was taken by betrayal.
Yeah.
And what sources clearly says is that they only activate that plan once Kerbogha left Edessa, not before. So that means that very likely the Crusaders were not sure that Kerbogha's objective was Antioch. They probably believed that Kerbogha's objective was Edessa itself, and just expanding there. So they realized that Kerbogha's objective is Antioch only once Kerbogha has left Edessa and comes towards them. But the same news would have arrived from Edessa if Kerbogha had crossed the region and just went straight for Antioch. They would also have sent a messenger that would have arrived about the same time. It would have taken about 2 days to get from Edessa to Antioch for a messenger. So at that point, there is no proof that Antioch could not have been taken in the same delay. So basically, they had a week to take Edessa from the moment Kerbogha left. They had more 2 weeks, but they had the time to take Edessa in that meantime, is what I mean. So for me, there are two major arguments to say that besieging Edessa or not would not have changed much in terms of the ability of the Crusaders to take Antioch before Kerbogha arrived. For me, as soon as they would have received the messenger, they would have activated the betrayal and they would have taken Antioch. Obviously, we cannot be certain, but I think it's the most likely explanation. So in that regard, I don't believe it's a mistake to besiege Edessa. I believe it was necessary to wait for reinforcements and that it didn't have consequences on the ability of the Crusaders to take Antioch. And I go even further than that. What would have been the reason for Kerbogha to abandon the siege of Edessa and go to Antioch? Well, the only reason that I can see is if Antioch was in an emergency to be relieved. But until Kerbogha had left Edessa for Antioch, he doesn't receive any information that the city is in a bad position.
Yeah.
They called for help, but they have no food shortage. The Crusaders have not been able to penetrate in the fortifications at any point. The city is not fully blockaded either. Um, it's not a catastrophe. There is no emergency at that point. The emergency, in fact, the message that there is an emergency only arrived to Kerbogha at the very end of May after he raised the siege of Edessa. So that cannot have influenced his decision to go, and he had no reason to just rush to Antioch before besieging Edessa. Because as I said, he didn't have his full army. Antioch was not in a desperate need for immediate reinforcement. And there was no proof that the Crusaders would not have taken Antioch anyway. So it's not a mistake. What is the mistake, in my mind, and what for me cost the campaign, is that he left Edessa before taking it.
So you think
He
he
should have stayed longer.
should have taken Edessa before even moving to Antioch?
Yeah, for me, his mistake is that he should have stayed longer to Edessa until he took it, or until he secured enough loot for the Turkmen.
Yeah.
Because the Turkmen did get some loot from the harvest, but nothing substantial. Um, and the consequence was that the Turkmen were growing quite impatient to have loot. And when his whole army, so basically he leaves Edessa, at March Dabik, he reunites, so it's about midway between Edessa and Antioch, he reunites with all the rest of the army, and then he moved to Antioch and he arrives on the 6th of June with his full army at Antioch. And by that point, there is a new siege starting against Antioch, and the Turkmen have not received any substantial loot. So they start to leave the army. And as I said before, it's about 50% of the army, maybe more,
Yeah.
that is gradually leaving. So at that point, for Kerbogha, it's a race. It's a race against time. The longer he stays in front of Antioch without defeating the Crusaders, the more troops are leaving his army, the more troops are deserting. So he's not in a good situation because he needs to have a victory as fast as possible. And that is pretty well demonstrated as well by an episode that some historians considered to be a fictional episode. So basically, Kerbogha started the siege by putting his camp on the mountains terrain near the citadel of Antioch and not in the plains. But a few days later, he moved his camp back to the plains. In Latin sources, this is explained by two reasons. The first one is that a comet would have been seen in the sky and that was bad omen and would have moved. And I agree, this is a sort of fictional, mystical explanation of the movement. However, there is another explanation that his troops were not happy because the mountainous terrain doesn't provide footing for the horses to feed them, which means that they had to buy footing or bring footing from somewhere else, which was raising the cost of the campaign. And for me, it's a really good explanation because at the time, commanders are not paying for the expenses of their soldiers. Soldiers pay their expenses. So the Turkmen had not received sufficient loot in Edessa,
No, on the
and
contrary,
here they had.
they were financing a campaign from their own pocket. They're losing money.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So basically, they had not gotten any substantial loot from Edessa or from the campaign by that point. And the commander was putting them in a bad terrain that was making them pay even more than they would have if they had been staying in the plains.
Yeah.
So they moved the camp back in the plains, probably under the pressure of his own troops. Despite tactically speaking, it was not as good to stay in the plains. So all that together, so the siege started on the 6th of June, and the final battle happened on the 28th of June. Well, during that month, or nearly a month, about 20 days, um, most of the Turkmen just disband. They just leave the army. And then you also have ethnical rivalry in the army. The Arab contingent is fighting the Turkish troops that hate each other, that despise each other. And Kerbogha here has been accused, I think rather rightly, of poor diplomatic skills, not being able to handle these rivalries. So I do agree. That's probably one of the explanations that historian had right for quite a long time. It's an explanation that has been made more than 50 years ago. And I think this one is pretty good. He wasn't a good diplomat. He wasn't a good commander in that regard. So gradually the emirs were not really happy to be here. But what we need to remember is that they were not happy to come in the first place. Most of the emirs came because Kerbogha was a threat to them. And they didn't want Kerbogha to actually succeed, because if Kerbogha was taking Antioch, he would have been controlling Mosul and Antioch, two very powerful cities, which means that the emir of Homs or Hama or the emir of Damascus would have lost their independence very likely, or they would not have been as independent as they were before. So they had no interest of Kerbogha succeeding. And Kerbogha was not really acting very well towards them either. So the Arab contingent left as well. So we arrived to the final battle on the 28th of June. And by that point, the army probably went from 60 to 90,000 men to 35 to 45,000 men. So losing about half the numbers of men they had, which is a problem, obviously. And news that remained, he couldn't be sure that they would commit to battle, because there still had some Turkmen there, but would they actually risk their lives for the loot? Very uncertain. The Mutawiya, so the volunteers, were still there, but they had nearly no military value because they had no training, no equipment, no discipline. And the remaining emirs, they were not happy about Kerbogha. So would they actually engage their troops? It's a real question. So he's not in a good situation at all. But the more he waits, the more troops are leaving. So he has at that point three choices. One, to say, okay, I'm not going to win. I'm going back to Mosul. And I just admit that I've been defeated. Well, obviously he can't do that because he would lose his prestige entirely. Second solution, to wait. But if you do that, he lose more troops. So he can't do that either. And final one is to try to seek for decisive battle and try to defeat the entire Crusader army in one single battle. And that's what he goes for. And I insist on in one single battle, because he cannot just defeat a bit of the army and wait for another battle, because otherwise we come in the second scenario, troops are leaving. So it's not satisfying at all. And obviously he's the besieger, not the besieged, which means that he cannot choose when the battle is going to happen or where. He has to wait for the Crusaders to decide to sally out by themselves. He can try to provoke them to a battle, but he cannot actually force them to go out.
Yeah.
So on the 20th of June, the Crusaders, because they had logistical issues, decide to sally out and try to win a battle against Kerbogha to win the siege. And for Kerbogha, it's the opportunity. He cannot lose that chance. He actually needs to defeat them all. And here we go to probably what has been studied the most by historians, which is the Battle of Antioch itself. And that battle, there is a consensus, or there was a consensus, to say that Kerbogha did a very poor plan by being arrogant, by being overly greedy, and trying to defeat the army, the entire crusading army, instead of just pushing them back in the city. But we've seen that he couldn't, in fact, have just pushed them back in the city because his army was disbanding. So he needed to defeat them all at the same time. So I think historians didn't get the emergency in which Kerbogha was and why he had to decide on that plan. So to summarize what happened in the battle, the Crusaders go out by a single gate, which means that it's taking some time to get an entire army of probably around 20,000 men through the gates, through a single gate. So it takes time. And Kerbogha is waiting for the entire army to be outside the city before he attacked them. And for historians, that was a mistake
Yeah.
because when the Crusaders had deployed, then they were stronger, and
Okay.
argue that he should have attacked them when they were sailing out through that gate. Obviously, if it was a normal situation, I would agree with them. He should have attacked them when they were half deployed, kill as many as he could, and wait for another battle a bit later. But as I argued before, he couldn't have waited longer. So he needed to defeat them all. So he needed to wait for them to go out of the city entirely. And at that point, he tried to surround them with his army by splitting his army in two different corps, if we want to call that corps. It's not really how we would define it in medieval terms, but in two groups. And he attacked by the rear and by the front, the Crusaders. And the attack fails. The attack fails because at the first shock between the troops, most of the Turkmen that were still in the army just decide to withdraw and to just leave the army. There's no point for them to risk their lives. They've not win enough loot to actually care, so they just leave. And by that point, so the Crusaders start to actually counterattack. But the lines have been completely disorganized because the Turkmen charged and then fell back. They fell back on the troops that were behind them. So they disorganized the ranks entirely. And the Crusaders arrive in disorganized rank and defeats completely that army. But that's the real fight. The real fight is when the Turkmen had left and these two remaining forces fight. And if we estimate that there is maybe 35 to 45,000 men left in the Muslim army, 20,000 in the Crusader force, by the start of the battle, once that first stage with Turkmen fully disbanding has happened, and if we look at the contingents that are said to participate in that second stage of the battle, it's probably about 20,000 against 20,000.
Yeah.
So you have two armies of the same size in the final stage of the battle. And in the 20,000 men of Kerbogha, you have probably half that are professional troops, quality troops, no problem with that. But you have the other half that are probably the volunteers that have no military value whatsoever. So by that point, the numerical advantage is completely gone. And the defeat of Kerbogha is quite obvious at that point. He tried a plan that was a very risky plan, let's say the least, but it was the only plan he could have followed. And that's probably something that has been dismissed a bit by other historians is what other plans could he have tried? Because admitting defeat was not a good idea. Trying just to have a secondary battle or a battle of secondary importance with a minor victory would not have been enough. So he tried, he failed, but it is not incompetence. I'd say the mistake, in fact, was in Edessa. And
Yeah.
all the desertions that happened were because Edessa was not taken. So the mistake was not to besiege Edessa, as I argued, but not to have actually stayed longer and took Edessa first. The second mistake was probably his very poor diplomatic abilities. But overall, the end outcome, the defeats for me, is coming to the weakness of the structure of the army itself. Um, they over relied on Turkmen. They over relied on volunteers that had a low military value or low loyalty. And it's a phenomenon you see in every campaigns of the Muslim coalitions in the next 2 decades of the Crusades, basically. Um, I've listed 4 campaigns that had the same issues. There are more, but the 4 that are probably the most famous. Um, 3 by Maudud, another emir of Mosul, in 1110, 1111, and 1113. And the same things happen. Emirs in the army are not happy. The army is mostly composed of Turkmen, and these campaigns are defeated. And then a bit later, in 1115, by Borsuk ibn Borsuk, which led to the very famous Battle of Tel Danith, which is a defeat for the Muslim as well. So I think the first responsible in the defeat of the Muslim coalition is the structure of the army itself. The second problem was the decision to leave Edessa before taking it. And the third problem was um, the diplomatic issues, the lack of diplomatic skills from Kerbogha. Sorry. But overall, he
Good.
didn't he didn't actually he wasn't a bad commander. He was probably a quite average commander or maybe a decent one. But he couldn't have overcome these issues. Um, I don't think there is anything that he could have done that would have solved the structure of the army itself.
Yo, they
Maybe he
had to
should have
restructure
ignored.
the army in order to counter Crusaders. And this
Yeah,
is what would happen later on in 12th
exactly.
century.
And the thing as well, it's a project I'm kind of working on at the moment, which I hope to make an article or maybe two about that, is to look at the evolution of
Yes.
that structure of the Islamic forces. Because I think it's one of the major explanation of why the Islamic forces failed in the early 12th century against the Crusaders and why Saladin in the end succeeded against them. It's because we moved from an army that relied on auxiliaries like Turkmen to an army that relied on personal armies, on Askar,
Yeah.
it, way more,
Standing
and
army.
on and
Yeah,
on
doing well
emirs
on the
that
standing
had
army.
more duties.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the structure of the army completely changed and explain a lot of the victories. And it's a project I'm kind of doing at the moment to try to see how much it evolved.
We'll talk
Um,
about that
even if it's
when we
probably
finish
going to
that
take a
project.
few years to have results. But yeah, so that's probably how to summarize it. It's obviously you have more elements, but it's a way to summarize the campaign of Edessa and why it failed. And so why it brought mainly was um, giving a timeline of the campaign from the start of the campaign to the end, and not just about the siege of Antioch. Um, Trying to explain why it failed in a different way, and probably trying to encourage historians to look at the entirety of a campaign a bit more,
Yes.
rather than just looking at the last few events
Last phase.
without taking in account the rest. And finally, um, treating sources equally, because we've seen that Matthew Philip's source was decisive to inform the siege of Edessa itself, and it has been underused, underutilized, and it's sadly quite common that Oriental Christian sources or Arabic sources are discarded or treated as second to Latin sources. So what I say by that, it's Arabic sources have been used pretty well in the last 2 decades in terms of number. The problem is when you have a Latin source saying A and an Arabic source is saying B and they disagree, they would favor the Latin source. And I'm like, why?
Of course,
Because they're not the best informed. None are better informed than the other. You must take in account both versions.
of course.
And sometimes when there is that disagreement, the favor tends to be on the Latin source, um, which is a bit problematic. But yeah. So overall, that's why I try to work on for this topic.
I'm going to follow up on your research, and I'm looking forward to reading your papers about the reform of the medieval Muslim armies that were engaged in the battles with the Crusaders and later on Mongols.
Well,
It
thanks for
was
that.
a turbulent period, yes.
Just for the audience to be sure, it's not something that is going to be out in a few months.
No,
It's a new research project, so it's going to take probably a few years before having decent results. The most likely, in terms of publication that will follow for me, is I'm going to look at Edessa and the siege of Edessa during the 12th century. So that's probably the fastest article that will come out, maybe something in 2025 in that regard. And I potentially have another article that will come out, but probably more in 2026, which will be about relations between besiegers and besieged, between
yeah.
Christian and Muslims, especially in that regard. There is a project about that, but the publication should be in 2026. So that would be the next research. Maybe for the readers, as the article is open access, maybe in the description of the video you could add a link to the article that we talked about,
Yeah, you can
as it
send me
is
the link.
free for people.
Send me the link, and I'm going to include that into
Yeah,
the
as it's free,
video.
it's quite rare. It's more frequent now, but it's quite rare than academic articles are free. I try to make sure it was. So that's pretty nice to actually
Please send me the
be
link,
able to share it.
and I'm going to
Yeah.
share that. Thank you
Well,
so
thank you very
much.
much.
Yeah, we'll continue collaborating. I'm planning to talk to you maybe in coming weeks. There are other topics that we can discuss.
Probably more in 2025, but
We're
yeah,
going to talk
because
about the
next few weeks are
ones.
hell.
We're going to talk about your scholarly article on Kerbogha's campaign and
Yeah,
also Western sources who
yeah, I think it could be
tackled
interesting
him
to look at
for
sources.
the past 150 years. We didn't talk about that today, but we're going to talk about European
Of course.
historians specialized in the First Crusade who blame him for the failure of the campaign and how they
Yeah, of course, of course.
campaign. Thank you so
I'd be
much.
happy to do that. Well, thank you very much.
We'll keep in touch.
Of course.
All the best.
All the best.
Bye bye.
Bye.